Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this chilly December evening. My name is Roddy Schrock. I'm the executive director here at Eyebeam, a platform for artists to engage society's relationship with technology. I feel like I'm on the verge of feedback, so I will just stand right here. For the last year, Eyebeam has been growing roots in our new home here in Bushwick. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We've been presenting over 40 free public programs to a cumulative audience of 17,000, from stimulating conversations, interactive workshops, and presentations by some of the most visionary artists and technologists in the world. As part of our 20th anniversary season, it's an absolute honor to host tonight's special program with two of the most celebrated people working in the field of media art, curator Barbara London and pioneering artist Joan Jonas. This event is the beginning of a podcast series we're doing with Barbara as part of a research project she's launching in tandem with her forthcoming book to be published by Phaidon in 2019. I first met Barbara a number of years ago, and I have to say I'm glad first impressions don't always stick in this case. I was running Eyebeam's residency program out in West Chelsea, and we were demoing some new works as part of our annual open studios. And it was a couple of minutes past closing time, and a number of people were still looking around and talking within the space. But I didn't see that someone was still fully immersed inside one of the interactive installations built by one of our residents. I was across the room. I hit the power switch on the control board to turn off the installation. To my chagrin, I then saw a startled person walking out from the installation. And I immediately realized I had turned off the project someone was intensely engaged with. My colleague next to me whispered, "Do you know who that is?" You just killed the project that Barbara London was viewing. Suffice to say, not the first best impression, but happily, her largesse allowed for a new friendship to grow along with ongoing opportunities to work together like tonight. For 4 decades, London has paved the way for media artists at MoMA, founding the museum's video and media art collection and curating its first ever show on sound art. Throughout that same period, Jonas gained wide recognition as one of the most important artists of our time, whose experiments and productions continue to be crucial to the development of many contemporary art genres. And tonight, the two will share insights and anecdotes from over 40 years of professional collaboration and friendship, followed by time for an audience Q&A. I was told to remind you all that our bar will also be open after the Q&A for mingling, so please join us there. It's truly, truly my pleasure to welcome Barbara London and Joan Jonas to the stage this evening. Thank you.
So thank you, Roddy, for that very beautiful introduction, and thank you, Roddy and Sally, for the wonderful tech to set this up, and my wonderful friend, colleague, and maybe I could call you a mentor too.
Pardon? What'd you say, Bob?
Could call you a mentor too.
Oh, okay.
So anyway, so I was going to say just a couple of things about Joan, that we've known each other for at least 40 years. We probably have had many dinners, many studio visits. We actually crossed Checkpoint Charlie once to go into East Berlin together. And so we've had lots of fun experiences. So Joan, maybe some of you know, she honed her technical skills. She has a career in both literature, sculpture, and was, when I met her, an avid film maven. So it's through Joan I heard of and learned of a filmmaker, a French filmmaker, Georges Franju, and others. So why don't we get the first slide up? So we are going to be serious, but I wanted just to say that both of us are Cancers, born in the summer, and both of us are from New York. And we're both freako about flea markets. So anyway, New York is, of course, the center of the world, right? Anyway, So I thought maybe we could start with you just saying a few words now that wonderful colleague Anna Yanevsky is here, who worked on the Judson dance theater show that's up now at MoMA, but Joan drifted in and out in that period when the Judson
Well, yes, I was in New York, of course, in the 60s, and I saw a lot of these performances and happenings, and it's one of the reasons that I switched from sculpture to performance. I was inspired by Oldenburg and Lucinda Childs and so on, and there's a wonderful show at MoMA now, I'm sure most of you have seen it, about the Judson, which was a particular place where all these dancers and artists, many of them performed during the 60s, the early 60s. So I came late to Judson. I didn't really see. I saw things and I saw works by those people, but I was never integral. I wasn't a part of Judson, but I was on the edge.
And I think over the years when we've talked, the Judson Dance Theater was downtown, and maybe the younger generations think, oh, New York was one big ball of wax. And it wasn't. There were very distinct groups. But I think a lot of people really crossed and looked and...
Well, the audience that I had and that we had was composed of people from many different disciplines, all the disciplines that you could imagine. So that's what the situation was. It was mostly downtown below 14th Street, and it was a small community compared to now. One knew many people, and there were many different groups within that community, like different video groups, more political ones, the ones in the art world. And once I had an argument, Lawrence Weiner and I had an argument with John Baldessari once. He said, you must have worked with Fluxus. And we both said, no, we didn't work with Fluxus, you know, because he's from California. So I'm just saying that as an example of how these groups existed side by side, but didn't necessarily always cross over.
So maybe next slide, please. So those of you who were not born yet, New York in the 60s, it was bankrupt here, and we all were mugged at different times, but you just lived with it, and this is just a picture of New York in the 60s, and this happens to be Tony Conrad, a wonderful filmmaker and wonderful artist.
Who did great work with Lamont Young in a very early period of Lamont's music.
Right.
And Jack Smith.
Right. And it was Michael Snow who encouraged you to go see Jack Smith.
That's right, yes.
I love that anecdote. So maybe next one, please. So down in, even before it was called Soho, Joan, you lived uptown, but then you were living downtown, and one of your neighbors was Nam June.
Well, we looked into each other's windows, actually. And he came for dinner one night with Shigeko, and they looked across, and immediately the next day they had curtains up.
Yeah, the experimentation.
Well, he was a magical person.
Yeah, the sense of humor, the wit, the charm of his eyes, and it was lovely. So also in the 60s, and you were mentioning before that you did indeed go to this, the Experiments in Art and Technology. An engineer by the name of Billy Kluver, some of you have met him. He sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But Billy and Bob Rauschenberg founded something called Experiments in Art and Technology, which drew upon the engineers at Bell Labs, the telephone company's experimental studios. So, so did you go to all of the 9 evenings?
No, I went to as many as I could. I mean, I was just beginning. What were the years? 60. I was just making that transition, and I was going to everything I possibly could go to. And as a matter of fact, I had just come back. I spent a year in Greece, and I came back, and I went to them. I said, I'll do anything. Please employ me. And they didn't. But I became friends with all of them later. But anyway, it was a fantastic experience to see those performances, those events.
So there were situations where, this is, I think, John Cage with all of his gear right in the middle of the armory and creating amazing sound program, listening to Childs, using the Doppler effect, I think, with big swaying buckets full of sand. That was her performance. And I think Rauschenberg had the artist Frank Stella do a tennis match with special sensors that were inside the handles so that the lights dimmed as Stella and a partner played tennis. So maybe we'll do the next. And Carolee was also very much present.
Well, Carolee was living in London a great deal, so I didn't get to know her until later. But I mean, we're good friends. But yes, and she was doing work quite radically different from what Yvonne Rainer and Deborah Hay and Simone were doing. And it looked like that. Right. It was Meet Joy.
And also, interesting anecdote is that Carolee, and I think she was with Anthony McCall at a point, and they were friends with Valley Export and Peter Weibel. So there was, in this time, there were festivals, events, lots of communication. And maybe we think people didn't travel as much, but people had no money.
A lot of people, I mean, for artists like me and my friends, we were recognized in Europe a lot more first before being recognized here. So often, the first public things I did were in Rome, for instance, but that was in 1972, so it was a little bit later. But in New York, you put on your own things, but you went to Europe and people sponsored you. So that was great. And then when you went to a place like Rome, you met everybody, you know, all the art de pauvre people when you went in Rome, going there. And they all came to your performances or your events.
Right. And it gave you a little bit of money.
A little bit, not much, a little bit.
Maybe we'll do one more. And this was, across the windows was Shigeko Kubota, who was also ultimately, not in 65, but in the early 70s, became the video curator at the Anthology of Artists.
And she was an artist, of course.
A wonderful one.
Yeah.
So maybe next one? Next slide. Oh, and I often just find this amusing, just to make sure everybody knows. It was a moment, it was, in a way, instant everything. You know, of course, instant soup, instant orange juice, the Polaroid. So we were used to quick.
Instant feedback.
Yeah. And let's go on to the next one. So you were one of the first in New York to get a video camera.
Yeah, there were other people, but we went to Japan in 1970, and I bought a Portapak there. And I always say now, it's hard for you young people to imagine how radical it was, the first Portapak, for people to have, artists to have this camera and be able to see themselves simultaneously on the monitor, and to be able to do everything in their studio to produce a video work.
And also you had been working, you mentioned feedback, but you had been already for a number of years working with the Mirror and doing events, actions with several collaborators or dance performers in the piece. So the Mirror was something, so this mirroring was kind of...
Well, I was inspired by Borges, the writer, the Argentinian writer, who mentions mirrors in his book Labyrinths. And so I was inspired by that, and I thought, oh, my first prop, that's going to be the mirror. So I adopted the mirror, and yeah, and then that turned out to be the video monitor and ongoing mirror. So the mirror performances kind of segued into video performance.
So they were kind of around the same time. So what Joan got as a Portapak was not like what you have with your phone. The camera itself weighed 20 pounds, and the take-up reel.
And you see what the tape deck looked like. We used to walk around with it on our shoulder, if you can. That's probably why I'm crooked now.
And no museum would show the work because in the early days, you had to thread up the tape deck, and it would come to the end, and who's going to rewind, right? So anyway, next slide, please. So in New York, often forgotten, it's in some of the history books, is Otto Pina and Aldo Tambellini's Blackgate Theater. So they were doing a lot with intermedia as well. Did you ever go to some of that? Or?
Actually, I didn't. I'm sorry. I missed it.
Yeah.
But I met Otto Pina later at MIT because he was part of the media lab at MIT. Right. So just toward the end of his life, it was nice to know him.
Yep. So maybe the next. So the other venue that was really important for technology in a way was Fillmore East. We think of it as, yes, Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix performed there, and but this was really razzmatazz, unbelievable, drop dead.
It was beautiful. I saw actually the Jefferson Airplane out in San Francisco, which was amazing, and then to see this also. Right. I don't know why it didn't go on, actually.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe it'll come back.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So then, this is, I just put it up because it's the time, David Bowie, Space Odyssey, and the US got a man to walk on the moon. So it was, you could say Space Oddity, it was also a druggy time. So you could think it was a trip to the moon, or a drug trip, which people forget. So, next one, please. And then, this is not so often reproduced, the artist Ray Johnson, his history of video. And it's always with Ray Johnson, who's also sadly died, it's very tongue-in-cheek. So he's got the history of video. He's got James Joyce. He's got Douglas Davis, who was a writer for Newsweek and also an artist. He's got just all kinds of people, Jonas Mekas.
I'd like a copy of that.
Okay, I'll give it to you. And also Joan is up there too. I put that up. And Bruce Nauman is right next to her.
Because you have to see it close up, I think.
Yeah.
Right. It's amazing.
So I'll send it to anybody who wants. Okay. Next slide. So next to Joan was Bruce Nauman, who actually was briefly around New York. He was invited by the gallerist Leo Castelli to come. Actually, I think it was Leo who helped him get his first video camera. But Bruce did not like New York City, and he lived out on Long Island and was making a number of these works. But Steve Reich and Bruce were friends, but Steve really lived in Soho.
Yeah. Well, I knew them both. I mean, we all knew each other. It's no big thing. And it was such an interesting, wonderful group of people. Yeah. So we all went to hear Steve's music.
And then this is just to talk about institutions having to figure out, artists were living in lofts. You had a very big, a decent-sized space. And if you were making work that was installation, you needed a kitchen or the Leo Castelli Gallery or some place to carry it out.
Well, just to mention the lofts, maybe you know, but one of the people was George McCunis, who helped artists buy lofts. Lofts were, I hate to say, almost nothing compared.
$8,000.
No, two I paid.
$2,000.
Yeah, and so artists bought lofts at that time, and aided by George McCunis, who bought them and then sold them to artists. He was really trying to help artists. He's a member of Fluxus.
So,
he's a friend of Jonas Mekas.
Friend of Jonas Mekas, yeah, and helped Jonas get one of the early anthology film archive spaces, which was around the corner from you. So these two shows at MoMA, in a way, were a way to figure out how to deal with all of this technology. You've got one, the machine as seen at the end of the mechanical age, and it's really a transition from the mechanical to then something that's right around the corner, and it included the video work of Namjoon and some of the Bell Lab work. But then there was the information show where cybernetics were in the air, and a wonderful curator, Kenneth McShine, was figuring out ways to put the. I'm sure you went to that, yeah. And
everybody did.
Everybody did. So, next one, please. And this, Jean Youngblood, whose book was one of the first to really, the worlds were kind of separated, film and video, right?
Well, filmmakers hated video. They hated the quality of the Portapac, the black and white, grainy. They just didn't like it at all. But video artists loved it. And I like this, the phrase expanded cinema. That's very important also to think about expanded media, expanded, going out of the, going over the boundaries out and becoming another form in a way. But I mean, we all went, I mean, I went to see all the filmmakers' work.
Right.
And
I wonder, did the
I was
filmmakers,
very influenced by film.
did they come to your work?
I can't remember. Some of them did, yes, of course, yeah.
I'm sure Michael Snow did.
Yeah, and so did Paul Sharits. And
Yeah. Next one, please. And then
our
Woody,
old friends, Dana and Woody.
and they originally had a loft, what, on 14th Street?
They started the kitchen.
Right. And then people would come to their loft and show their new work, and it became so crowded, they figured out they had to find someplace else. So there was a hotel on Mercer Street, and it's not the one you know now and you have a drink at. It was a really rundown hotel, very grotty, and in the basement was the kitchen, and that's where the kitchen started. So,
But they were a special kind of video artists. They took machines apart, and if you went to their studio or something, you'd see the machine being in pieces, and then they put it back together again. But they developed their own technology. And the first time I saw Steina's work was actually not until the mid-'70s. And she's Icelandic, and I never saw a landscape on video filmed the way she did on video. It's very hard to shoot landscape on that black and white video because there's no depth. But Steina made beautiful work and did, of course, after that.
right. So we'll go another one, please. So this was kind of the milieu of Soho. That's the kitchen on Mercer Street in the old hotel. That's Artist Space in 1973, and that's Cindy Sherman as the receptionist, the artist. And there's Gordon Matta Clark at a space called 112 Green Street. Was an important space.
Yeah, where people could go and make work and have an audience and so on. It was completely open. It was very loose in those days, so.
So next one, please. And then how you worked with the equipment, it was relatively new, so the Video Freaks making this book, a guide to how to use, repair, and the maintenance. It was all kind of a sharing of, if you learned something about the tool, then you shared it, no? So we'll go on one more. And then we come to, this was one of the first videos we acquired at MoMA, I'm happy to say. And maybe I'll let you talk a little bit about it, or how you arrived at it.
Well, and I don't have the same relationship to technology now that I had then, because then it was all hands-on. So you could turn a little knob, as you probably know, on the monitor, and you'd have the vertical roll. Can't do that anymore. And so I made a video using the structure of the vertical roll. And I'll just describe, we shot it out in California in Robert Irwin's studio he had just moved out of. It was beautiful light because he'd put a scrim over the skylight, so it had a very filtered light. And we practiced it for 2 weeks, and then it's all one shot. There are no edits. But it's made by shooting off the video monitor, the camera recording. So the signal is, the performance is sent from the camera to the monitor, and then another camera records off the monitor, because you can't record the, you have to record it, the vertical roll, you can't, it doesn't show up on the, in other words, you have to record it with another camera. And so that's what the story of that piece is. And so it was part of a big, my first big video project called Organic Honey's Vertical Roll, Organic Honey's Visual Telepathy.
So the next, and we're going to show a quick clip just at the very beginning, I think 1 minute. So do you want to do the clip?
I was interested in how, when you look at that vertical roll, I don't know if it happened to you, but if you look at it for 20 minutes, the room rises after you. It really affects your perception of space.
Also, I want to mention, you made that before we had flat screens. And
Yeah, it was for a monitor.
so that monitor was a box, like a piece of furniture. And it was head size. So there's a kind of intimacy with the relationship to it.
Yeah, you couldn't have a big room full of people looking at it until later projections. But I remember the first time I saw it projected, it was horrifying. And a woman reviewed it in some newspaper. It was at the Columbia Circle. She said it was the worst thing she ever saw.
So it's complicated, making a work that was intended for one scale.
Well, actually, I mean, I think we've all relaxed. At the beginning, we didn't want these things to be projected, right? But then we relaxed, because it's the only way you can show it to people. But it is different. It's really meant for the glass box. That's what I think of that box.
Yeah. Almost like a terrarium or something, yeah. Okay, next one, please. This is just to show you, I don't know if anybody saw the show of Gordon Matta Clark up at the Bronx Museum earlier this year. But Gordon was a very important artist. Maybe next one, please. A very wonderful, wonderful human being, smart, did important work, and was a co-founder of Food Restaurant, which lasted from like 1971 till he was involved until 74, I think. Did you hang out there?
A little bit, yeah. But I knew Gordon pretty well. He was a wonderful person, he was. And he was working on the docks, you know, making these big structures, cutouts in the docks. He made one there.
So he would take a very derelict building, or like those were the buildings on the docks around on the west side, and cut holes, and it was illegal what he was doing.
Actually, that's interesting to bring that up, is that in New York at that time, you could do things in different empty lots. Like I did something at night down in Wall Street. Pat Steer and I and a cameraman, Andy Mann, with my cones, we went down there and we spent about 2 hours improvising and running around. And police don't come. And now you can't do that. But then you could, like Gordon could work on the docks. A lot of people worked, I mean, some people worked on the docks at that time, and so on, yeah.
We'll do the next one, because then it's a work in which he performed in your work, Song Delay.
That was on the that was in the Lower West Side, in empty lots. They just torn down all those buildings, so the audience sat in the roof of a building and saw the piece.
So it was a lot about scale and
distance.
Right,
yeah.
and sound. So, yeah.
But I mean, I always describe these cities like New York and other cities at the time, and then Berlin later, cities that have holes in them, where you can go and do things. And we don't have, now, of course, they're filling all the holes up, which is one of the problems in New York.
Next one, please. So I just bring this in just because Jonas Mikas, filmmaker, and everything that says there. But he was very supportive of you and your work. So
Well, he was so important for so many people because he had the Anthology Film Archives, the Cinematheque, which I went to as often as possible, and many people did. And it was such an important place for artists.
and
It's still here, of course.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Because he allowed you, or invited you, or offered, in actually 1975, you did the first version of Mirage.
Yeah, and Shigeko was the curator. So, but anyway, I'll just have a little anecdote. He and P. Adam Sidney, who was also running Anthology, because I used the screen and I made it go up and down. And it was one of those film screen you could open it and close it and up and down by just pulling these buttons. And I was doing it I used it as a structuring device, but I was doing that during the rehearsals. And P. Adam said to Jonas, "She's going to break that screen." And Jonas said, "No, let her do it. It's okay." So that was his attitude toward it.
But it was very magical to actually be there because Joan's working with the screen. She's got monitors, film projection, very beautiful live use of the space. So you would have performed that probably, what, 5, 10 times?
I think 10 times each year. I did another version of it. But it was wonderful. It's unusual for an artist to be given a space to work in. It doesn't happen so often.
Yeah.
And they were very generous
Right.
with that space.
So then at a certain point, you locked it down. Next slide, please. So then it becomes Mirage and installation. And it's got 3 years because it began in '76. And did you do it in '94 for Doreen?
I did it at the Stedelijk, yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
when you showed it in New York and MoMA acquired it.
right, yes.
So,
And then I still show it. And every time it has to be slightly rearranged for the space, but not radically.
yeah.
But it became more layered with one more projection, so I add things to it. And it's a piece I go back to. It inspires me. And, you have unfinished ideas and ideas that can be developed. So that was
Right.
one of them.
Right. Next, please. So then we're going to take a little bit of a jump cut because we're not doing all of Joan's career, but we're then going to go, and this is a work that was acquired by MoMA around 2013, and was just up for over a year, I think.
Yeah, it's incredible for me. It's great.
So it's got many magical parts. Do you want to talk a little
Well,
bit?
it started out as a small lecture performance at MIT, which is now part of it, and in which I was working for the camera overhead, and the audience saw in the projection what I was doing for the camera. And that became the beginning. It was based on an Icelandic writer, Halldór Laxness, his writing a piece called Under the Glacier. And then maybe a year later I was asked, I can't remember exactly, but I was asked, I knew that I had to go on working on it. So a friend of mine invited me to go to the Lofoten Islands, and I knew I wanted to shoot. Under the Glacier is about a glacier. I had to shoot in the snow and ice. And so I went to the Lofoten Islands and then developed it for Document 13. It was in a little house in a field, a special place that the curator wanted artists to experiment with these little houses. And then I changed it because I felt like you couldn't really perceive the sound and image looking through the windows of a house. I had it inside the house. And so then I worked with these Soji screens because I'd spent some time in Japan working with Soji screens and made a different structure. It's still up at MoMA if you want to go see it. But anyway, so it went through different stages. This is it. It's not going to change again. But it's really when I began to think about what's happening in the environment, because it's called Under the Glacier. And so beginning to work on that, I thought glaciers are melting. And so I had to, none of my work is, I don't take it to the period, I bring it into the present. So it's a quick
Nice. So maybe we'll next slide. Yep. And there's another view of it. And then we'll go next. And then we come to your work that I think I first saw up at Gavin Brown. And
What do you want me to say? I mean, what do you think?
what?
Were you going to say something?
No, I would
Oh.
love you to talk about it because
Oh.
it's very
It's
complicated.
called Stream or River Flight or Pattern. That was the title I came up with when I began working on it, and then it just stuck with it. But anyway, it's composed of three different video pieces, and drawings of birds on panels on the walls, because birds are a major subject. After I finished Reanimation, sometimes you feel like you have nothing else. So I was traveling a lot. I took my camera with me. I went to Singapore, to Genoa, to just for the three pieces, to Spain, and then finally to Vietnam. I took my camera with me and recorded what I was interested in the first place. The first video, birds and trees, and in Genoa, the graveyard, and then put these pieces together in New York and performed in front of projections in my loft. The second one was done in Santander. I had a workshop, and it's a shadow piece. We don't have an image of that tonight. And the third piece, which we'll show a little bit about, I'll talk about them now because we're going to show them all at once. The third piece was really inspired by my trip to Vietnam, although there are other shots in that. So each of the video works is composed of, I call it journeys, is another way to describe this piece. Also, I went to India, to Kochi, and we went on these boats in these rivers. Did you ever go on those? Yeah, beautiful. Anyway, so going to Vietnam was a big thing for me because I was a mentor for a young Vietnamese artist. We'll see her later. And you know, for an American to go to Vietnam is very, it's special. It's not that I went there and did something about my feelings about the Vietnam War, but in order to go there, I had to really prepare myself to go there. But when I went there, it was simply to see my mentee's work and her friends and to meet young artists. And then we went around, we visited various places where I was interested in paper villages. They have villages in which they make one thing, for instance, kites, paper animals, and so on. And so anyway, the three works came together as one installation.
So I guess we go right to the videos? Okay. So they're just a couple minutes each one.
So I was interested in trees too, and so in Santander, I filmed these incredible chestnut trees. And then in Genoa, this is the columbaria, they call. And I did a number of different things with this shot. You won't see it now, but I really liked this. That's a mirror. Up in Canada, I have a big mirror, and I've done several performances for the mirror, making drawings. But this is an example of putting a work together with no idea what it is to begin with. You know, it doesn't have a literary story. So I go back and forth working that way and working with more of a structured reference to literature. So this is the one inspired by Vietnam. The birds.
Coyote on the shelf, looking out window.
Lion by the window, wood, colors, covered with writing.
Books nailed to table, surveillance, flashback, movement from mad to bird.
Animal trail, flight patterns, shadows.
Large fox head, paper mache, red mouth, top shelf, looking at coyote.
Tiger mask, orange with black markings.
Squat, bird, green, purple, yellow, ceramic with interior bell.
Bird on branch, shot, stuffed, brown, varied.
Perched owl on green base, wood is split, heart-shaped face.
Gray, oversized elephant, painted wood, exaggerated trunk.
Behind, white wooden carved rabbit, gentle.
It's my collection of folk art that I'm talking about.
Your collective.
I don't think, there may not be any shots of Vietnam in this, but there are in the piece. Well, this is Vietnam. This is India, Kochi. Remember?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm talking about it like it's a travel log. But
Did you want to add anything, or?
I mean, it's hard because it's so much work. But the one part of the Vietnamese footage that's not shown is one interesting thing for me was the paper village where they make paper animals. Very elaborate, beautiful. They're big, all kinds of animals, horses and other things, and with colored paper. And then we were lucky. We went to the paper village to a little. There are many different little houses that make different paper objects, and then they're used in these ceremonies. We were very lucky. We went to a place nearby, not a monastery exactly, where this ceremony was taking place for the mother goddess in Vietnam. It's not connected to any religion, as far as I understand it, but it's the goddess of nature. And there were maybe 30 people watching this woman do a ceremony for hours. She was putting on different kimonos and taking them off. And she didn't mind, they didn't mind. I had my camera, I was recording, and they didn't mind. And then at some point, they bring in these incredible paper animals, and the woman does something, and then they take the paper animals and they burn them. They take them out to a place where they're all burned. So for me, that's an incredible metaphor.
So very beautiful.
But I didn't use very much because I had to be very careful not to have it, to tip in the wrong direction.
So we'll go one more. Let's see. Oh, you talked about your collection. So this was, I thought, very beautiful at Gavin Brown Gallery on the ground floor when you walked in. This was, in a way, Joan's life. Something your grandfather or your great uncle had carved, or?
Well, there was something my great uncle had carved, yeah. But they're all things I've collected over the years, up in Canada and also in various, Barbara loves secondhand places, flea markets, everywhere. And yeah. And I use them in my work a lot. Like I have a whole collection of little houses, like a miniature village that I've used a lot in my work. So they're things, they go in and out of my work.
And then the dog or the coyote?
Coyote from a piece, yeah.
Yeah, so that's been in your work. And then the drawings. So it was very, very beautiful. You felt you were getting a very intimate look at you. So we'll do one more. So Joan has been a teacher in Europe at the Rex Academy, up at MIT, where you're a professor emeritus, I think. But you already mentioned, I'm not going to pronounce her name right, Tao.
Well, Tao.
Tao. And she just won this award at the Han Nefkens Foundation. But it was very beautiful. We'll go one more. This is a still from her piece.
She actually, she was a mentee. I was a mentor through the Rolex Foundation. And when I saw her work, she was a painter. And she'd just begun to do a little bit of video. But she's a beautiful painter. And I knew she was a really good artist. And then she developed this piece. And her work is beautiful. And I'm so glad. It's such a nice connection, Barbara, that you gave her. Yeah. You're one of the people that gave her.
I was on the jury.
Yeah, I'm very happy because it was very important to have somebody from a place like Vietnam and to be a woman, because it is harder for women to be recognized everywhere. Yep. So, but she deserves it. It's not just because she's a woman.
Yeah. And when I was on the jury and saw the work, I just thought this is the eye of someone very special. So, yeah. So I think that's kind of it for, we'll take questions if you want. Sally and Roddy? Okay. And if you don't, that's okay. We'll have a glass of wine. There's one. Oh.
Yeah. We're actually going to, I think we're going to pass a mic around, actually.
Oh, wait, here. Here, Glenn, ready?
I would love to hear you respond to or expand on your argument that you had with John Baldessari, where he then suggested that you might be influenced by Fluxus work, but I won't ask you that unless you want to respond to it. I then started thinking, well, about your relationship with Fluxus, because I think you come from a very different place, but
I do, but I knew some Fluxus people, of course, but I never felt part of Fluxus. But I think there's a lot of common. We have, all these groups have something in common, I think, a little bits in common. But no, I don't know, it's just that John insisted. That must be true. And yeah.
And I also remember, I'm going to take that back. I also remember being at a conference at MoMA in 73, 74, I think you were there as well, where all kinds of people came to talk about video. And it was, again, like everybody jumping on the bandwagon briefly for some people. But Baldessari made a very cogent point. He saw everybody talking as if it were the bee's knees, and he said, it's just another pencil.
Yeah, that's true. I remember that. We were all sitting in a row, remember? Yeah.
There's the question in the back. Oh, yeah, okay. You call them out.
Hi, Joan, Barbara. Thank you so much for the inspirational talk. It's really amazing to see your work. So my question is, do you have any general advice for young emerging artists working with video and performance?
Well, I mean, I have advice in general for artists, which I say over and over again. One thing is to form a peer group, so because it's very difficult. I know it is. It's very difficult to have your work shown in a space you might want to show it in. So I think you should form your own groups, your own peer groups. And what the artists have been doing for years is opening their own spaces. And that's one way to get your work out. I don't have any particular advice for video per se, because I think you're working with different technologies. And I'd have to know more about what you particularly do. But also, then I always say you have to work hard and love what you do, because you may not get recognized. And you may not get recognized for a while. But yeah, I think that to look at the technology, I think it's perfect to mention John Baldessari saying it's just a tool. It's a pencil. Yeah, it's a tool. And I've always tried to balance it without getting too dependent on the technology, to have it dominate. Anyway. But I do think I would feel better answering if I knew more about your work or what you're trying to do. Because it would be, I'd say something different to each person. It depends on what you want, you know. That's the most important thing.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Joan. I'm here. I stood up so you can see me. I wanted to ask you, Joan, I know that Douglas Crimp said once that with other artists you invented video, and with other artists you invented performance, but you alone, you invented the hybrid of video performance. And it's true that video and performance are very much connected in your work. Also, the video and installation very often is some kind of a documentation of your work without being a documentation. There are always this blurring, and as you said, your previous work are always an inspiration for the future work. So I wanted if you could elaborate a little bit more about the performative part of your work, the moments when you are performing.
Yeah, I was just saying tonight, please don't call me a performance artist. I'm just saying that because I don't want to be tied. It's just, many artists don't want to be tied down to one discipline. And so words like that, you know, somebody else invents those phrases. But on the other hand, I'll say that performance and moving with my body is really one of the basic structures of my work, and one of the ways in which I find movement, I find narrative, all the things that you see, through moving my body in relation to, say, a video projection. But I don't like to be called a performance artist because what does that mean, a performance artist? To me, I don't think people can understand what that means. So I'd rather just be called an artist, but that's not really what your question is.
Saying video performance artist.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, just it happened because I was performing with Mirage, and I bought a Portapack. I brought it back. I was, like everybody else, fascinated with sitting in front of the monitor with the camera, the closed circuit situation, inventing. I think it was because of my interest, for sure. It was the influence of film, because I'd been looking at film, studying it, by going to film at the Anthology, and also all over New York there were film theaters showing, you know, Fassbender and so on. So I was really interested in film. And when I got the Portapack, I thought, now I can make my own films. I called them films to begin with. And so all of my early video explores the relationship of video to film. So my first question was, how is video different from film? What is peculiar to video? One is the vertical roll, of course. But so it was just a natural thing to step into the space of video. And then to the first performance I did using video, Saul LeWitt brought his class to my loft to see it. It involved a camera, a monitor, and a table, and a lot of props. And I performed so that the audience saw on the monitor what I was doing, manipulating the prop. And so that fascinated me, you know, because I could make a complex statement by layering these different, the audience saw the live performance simultaneously with the video projection. And I perform my body, and I work with objects. And in the beginning, not with any kind of language. And so that's how I began. And then I said in the very beginning I wanted to develop my own language because I was in the middle of a minimalist. My good friends were all minimalist, many of them minimalist artists, quote. And I really wanted to break out of that tradition. And of course, Jack Smith was there, so he was definitely not a minimalist. And so it just became a way that I could develop my own language to put these things together and, yeah, to explore something that was relatively unknown at that time. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, thank you both for speaking. I'm a big fan of your work, Joan. I wondered if there's anything that you would be willing to share about your experience of staying emotionally present with a transforming environment and planet.
Say that again?
Staying emotionally present within a natural environment and planet that is rapidly changing
I focus on my work. I mean, I find it, we all know how depressing it is to read the newspaper every day. And it's a dire situation wherein I know. I focus on my work, and I'm working right now, I mentioned a work involving oceans, and you know what's happening to the ocean, but I focus on the, it's about fish and about creatures partly, and I'm working with children, so I focus on the, what are the miraculous aspects and qualities of these creatures. And so that's what I focus on. My piece is not about the tragedy that's happening. But of course you see it, I mean, because everybody, the audience comes and they know. And I imply, but I'm not making a didactic piece. I'm making a piece about creatures. I can't really, I won't go into it, but that's basically, I think all of us, and I have friends who are, you know, for various reasons, the work is what keeps you alive and going and being positive, because the work is positive. It's the only thing, I think that art is one of the few positive areas that we have, you know, and I think that's why so many people go to museums and we share our work with each other.
So maybe we go one more? Okay.
A friend of mine who's passed away, he taught at the University of Iowa, Hans Braider. He was an intermediate artist. I don't know if you crossed paths with him.
Yes, I know. You
Yes.
probably know. I knew Hans from the 70s.
Okay. He had a wonderful story about how he had been invited to show some work. I'll use my biological anatomy. Hans Braider he had a CD that needed to be projected, and the gallerist didn't know what to do with it, and so they installed a CD on a pedestal. They didn't find the monitor to play it on, they just installed the CD because it was a nice shiny circle, which I thought was very telling. I wonder, Joan, you mentioned the educators that were using the video, the porta-packs. I grew up amongst educators in Philadelphia who experimented with it, and I'm curious about the strange connection between people in the arts and people in education, and whether the boundaries were crossed and enough dialogue occurred so that...
I don't know what you mean by people in education, sorry.
Radical educators who were, like yourself, you know, using new technology in interesting new ways. The question is, you know, in the 70s, were the artists that you hung out with in New York, were they in a dialogue with these educators?
Well, I wouldn't separate what you call these educators from artists, because many artists were teaching. And so, why don't you speak to that? Do you want?
Yeah, I guess I don't understand either. Like, everybody I knew was teaching, and even in the 70s, nobody had money, and
I mean,
teaching was one way.
There wasn't a separation like you're implying.
Yeah,
Right.
and everybody was in dialogue, so.
Sure. Well, I guess what I'm arriving at is that if there had been enough momentum where this new culture of feedback systems, which is what the camera and the porta-pack and the monitor provides, feedback can be with society, students and teachers, students in their environment, artists in their environment. We would have had a culture that could have stood up against the crushing of, say, net neutrality. Like, we're in a place where there's huge change going on, and we need a strong answer to how we're not addressing Google and Apple and all these large corporate frameworks that are not fostering art and a good, positive relationship with nature.
But I think it's out there. It's, you've got all kinds of pockets of people interacting through social media, and they form networks. And yes, you've got those big cats, so those big people who have a lot of control, but there are communities. There are communities online, communities in the cities, communities around the libraries or around, I mean, they form everywhere. So it's not like we and they. Yes, there is a we and they, but there's a lot of we's. I don't know.
No, it's true. But also, I mean, there's always been those big bad guys.
Our museums were big bad guys in the 70s. Everybody with power, television stations, museums.
I mean, I think if you, I, for instance, don't want to battle. I have no desire to battle these big corporations myself, you know? It's something, I don't know, we can't really address that now, but.
Anyway, let's do it over a glass of wine. So, Joan, thank you for opening up.
Thank you, Barbara. I just want to say, Barbara, thank you. Barbara and I have known each other. I didn't say anything at the beginning, but we've known each other for 45 years, actually. So it's really great. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you, Barbara. Thank you.